We are now live on Facebook with the event, The Transatlantic Relationship in Demanding Times.
Hello and welcome. I'm Eric Fussfield, Deputy Director of the B'nai B'rith International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy, also Director of Legislative Affairs, coming from the Washington, D.C. area. B'nai B'rith is the oldest and best known Jewish advocacy and social service organization based in the United States and with members and supporters in more than 40 countries around the world. This program is the first installment of B'nai B'rith's Expert Analysis series, featuring global perspectives on pressing issues. Fittingly, today's focus is on the transatlantic relationship, appropriate for our first such episode because B'nai B'rith is an organization deeply committed to the transatlantic partnership. With our deep roots both in Europe and the United States, indeed throughout much of the Western Hemisphere, B'nai B'rith is mindful of the shared democratic values on which multilateral organizations such as the European Union, NATO, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe are based. And we recognize the crucial importance of democratic principles such as human rights, pluralism, and the rule of law to a stable world. Today, we'll be discussing some of the timely issues facing the transatlantic relationship during this period of multiple crises. Joining us are two legislators from both sides of the Atlantic. First is Representative Ted Deutch of Florida, who recently marked his 10th anniversary as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Mazel tov on that milestone, Congressman. An attorney by way of background, he serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and is chairman of its Middle East, North Africa and Terrorism Subcommittee. He's also a co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism. Congressman Deutch has established himself as a leading foreign policy voice in the House Democratic Caucus and as a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I'll now pass the virtual microphone across the Atlantic to my Brussels colleague, Alina Brickman, B'nai B'rith's Director of European Union Affairs, who will introduce our second speaker.
Thank you very much, Eric, and welcome to both our guests. It's a pleasure to co-moderate this discussion today. And I am delighted that joining Representative Deutch is MEP Nicu Stefanuta. Mr. Stefanuta has been a member of the European Parliament since May of 2019. He's originally from Romania, so in full disclosure, we are compatriots. He's working on a lot of important issues such as the environment and public health policy, but for the interests of our conversation today, he is vice chair of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with the United States. And before assuming this current position, he was serving in Washington, D.C. in the European Union's delegation there. So he's a wonderful fit for our conversation today. And that said, I believe we can begin. So I'll pass back to Eric.
Very good. Thank you, Alina. Congressman Deutch, we're in an extraordinary moment right now as we're facing simultaneous international disasters, a global pandemic, an economic recession, and racial strife. What has our experience in these difficult times told us about the state of the transatlantic relationship, and what does it suggest about the future of that relationship as we move past these crises?
Well, first, I appreciate the question. I want to thank B'nai B'rith for the invitation to participate, and thank the CEO. I think Dan Mariashin is on, and thanks President Kaufman and Eric and all that the Washington D.C. office does, the work you do to engage with Congress. And it's great to be with a fellow legislator. And Nico, I know that hopefully we'll have the opportunity to see one another in Brussels or in Washington at some point in the near future. So let me get to your question. I'm asked every time I engage with our European partners in any setting, whether the transatlantic partnership has been fundamentally changed. And it's a variation of the question that you just asked. And the answer is no. I think what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic is the perfect illustration of why this relationship, why this partnership is so important. We are so much stronger when tackling these challenges alongside our transatlantic partners, whether in the case of the pandemic, whether it's sourcing medical supplies, whether it's pushing back against Chinese misinformation, ultimately rebuilding the economy, the global economy. We should not be turning inward. We've got to collaborate on vaccine research. We have to look at best practices as we look toward fully reopening our economies and our schools. We've got to work in tandem to recover. And China doesn't take this opportunity to use economic influence to gain a foothold in our backyards for granted. They recognize that if there's division, there's an opportunity. And I know that many of our allies are concerned about the state of the relationship. It's not the first time the transatlantic relationship has been tested, but I know how strongly both Democrats and Republicans in Congress feel about the importance of these relationships. Most members of Congress don't question the strategic value and utility of NATO, don't support launching a trade war against the EU. These are not actions conducive to strengthening transatlantic solidarity. So I spend a lot of time on the phone with European ambassadors. I know it's hard to explain some of the things that happen in Washington, but that's why engagements like this are so helpful, why they're so important, and why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to join with you, because I know that the fundamental tenets of the transatlantic security and economic partnership serve our mutual national interests so well.
Absolutely. Aluna, did you have another comment to add to this or question to pose to MEP Stefanuta?
Well, I would love to hear MEP Stefanuta's reflection on the general question, but perhaps to both of you, since Congressman Deutch, you already mentioned that your colleagues do not question the utility of NATO. You could also shortly both reflect on the state of NATO today and its future, especially in a period where the importance of internationalism seems to be kind of at play. But Mr. Stefanuta, let's go to you first.
Sure. I would just like to say hi, first of all, to Congressman Deutch. I hope the people of Florida are well during this crisis, this pandemic. We pray that everything goes well in your crisis management. And not only we pray, but we also do a lot of things, because we think from the European Union that solidarity is what is needed right now. I do concur in his evaluation that the transatlantic bond is strong, is stronger than might be perceived with an open eye. However, we do sometimes take the relationship for granted. We should remember that we should work on it. You know, it's a lot of the times politicians use the equivalence of a marriage, you know, in which it goes through different phases, but ultimately we're married. Nevertheless, we should never allow our marriage to come to the bitter stages where the partners barely speak to each other, but they're still married. But we should strive to keep the relationship going, to be creative as in a relationship, to take each other for dinner, to take each other for trade partnerships, to ask each other before we want to have a foreign relations enterprise. Now, I've been working in this field since about 2012, and I was reminding myself right now, back then the huge issue was chlorinated chicken. Chlorinated chicken was the biggest issue on the transatlantic agenda. And you have to think, that seems ridiculous right now when we have this whole plethora of other challenges. But then we went in 2014 through the spying on friends scandal. Later, 2016, we tried to have a trade partnership, which I supported, was called TTIP. Unfortunately, that endeavor didn't go through. I don't think personally that neither one of us was prepared, honestly, in terms of the public for it. So it kind of naturally failed. But we should get back. We should get back to dating. We should get back to taking each other for fancy dinners and really respecting and loving one another, because it's important. And because the congressman spoke about the importance of a vaccine, the European Commission just authorized Resvimir, the treatment that appeared in the States for the moment. It seems to be a good candidate for a treatment. It's not a vaccine, but it's a treatment. We do hope that America will share some of that innovation, because we will do the same thing. And you know, Congressman, the Commission, the European Commission has invested a lot of money into this. We are open, and we already said publicly that whatever solution Europe finds, it will not be only a solution for Europe, but it will be something we share.
Excellent. And with respect to Alina's question about NATO,
Yeah.
I feel like every moment, moments of crisis and moments of non-crisis seem to be an opportunity to ponder NATO's future. It's always being reevaluated. But what are your thoughts about that future as things stand right now, to both of you?
Well, I would first I would just jump in and acknowledge. I remember conversations. I remember those conversations about chickens taking place in the context of the Munich Security Conference, where on the sidelines of that event, where there were really important discussions about strategic issues facing our countries, the Europe and all of Europe and the United States. That was a really significant issue, and I think now we realize, in light of what's transpired over the past few years and challenges to NATO, just how important NATO is. We're not really focused on Russia, but the role that NATO plays in pushing back against Russian aggression is as critical now as it's been in recent memory. And most members of Congress understand how burden sharing works, and even if sometimes the president mixes that up, and we understand how valuable NATO has been serving alongside U.S. troops in Afghanistan. I mean, this is a really critical partnership, and right now it's an especially critical partnership as we look to preserve and defend the shared democratic values and the whole idea of liberal democracy that other countries are trying to chip away at.
I fully agree. I fully agree with the congressman. I believe that NATO alliance is the greatest and mightiest alliance the history of the world has seen. And in that regard, we must remember that NATO does not only mean European states and the United States, but also other Western allies that are equally important here. We should not forget, in a world, as the congressman says, where our strategic rivals are trying to undermine this alliance, are trying to undermine the trust we have for one another and the might we have together. So I fully believe in NATO, and I just wanted to say one thing. Unfortunately, COVID had another impact. It stopped us from doing important exercises in Europe. The deployed Operation Defender Europe that started right in March with a few tens of thousands of American soldiers to test mobility on the European territory. And I hope we get back to having another joint exercise, because it's very important. With COVID, we saw the limits that we have, and I think it was a good dress rehearsal. I'm sorry to say it. It was, in a way, a good dress rehearsal for something worse. A conflict is something potentially worse. So if there is anything good to take from the crisis, is we saw the flaws that we ourselves have in terms of rapid reaction. And maybe we can use that lesson in the context of NATO to not be blindsided if a conflict were to arise.
Excellent. I find that this is a very energizing conversation already, because I'm hearing multiple affirmations of the value of continuing the dialogue, and so we'll all, I think it really gives all of us who support this relationship a sense of purpose, and we'll need to continue doing our part, all of us, whether we're NGOs or public officials or others, to keep this dialogue going. There is an inevitable consequence to the kind of events that we have experienced recently. History has taught us that anti-Semitism thrives on turmoil, and the current period is no exception. And we've seen a spike in anti-Jewish and anti-Israel conspiracy theories with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as physical attacks and other manifestations of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred, with respect to both racial protests and lockdown protests coming from both the left and the right. Congressman Deutch, you're a leader in the fight against anti-Semitism. How can we keep pace as this social illness intensifies and shows itself to be increasingly adaptable to changing narratives and contexts?
Well, as you point out, the one thing that's clear is that anti-Semitism doesn't go away during a pandemic. There are still cases of anti-Semitism, violence, intimidation. It happens in person, and we've seen it happen online more and more as conversation shifted and events shifted to the virtual world because of the pandemic. We've seen the conspiracy theories really multiply during national emergencies like this. That often happens, and there's some really frightening ones, and Jews are often the target. In Congress, we've devoted resources to securing the community institutions. That's done in partnership with law enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security. But we've also worked hard to elevate the issue, to bring the IRA definition of anti-Semitism forward. And so many European countries have adopted the definition. I happen to think it's an area where we can and we should do more in our country. The Inter-Parliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism was founded to bring together parliamentarians to work on a global scale to fight anti-Semitism. And obviously we're seeing this alarming, right now especially, we're seeing this alarming connection between extremist groups in Europe and the United States. This is the kind of transatlantic cooperation that we don't like to see. The subcommittee that I chair has jurisdiction over international terrorism, and we spent a lot of time looking at the rise of white nationalist groups and white identity terrorism and the transnational connections between these groups. And so, look, there's been increasing discussion about designating some of these groups as foreign terrorist organizations, designating them domestically. That's certainly an area of information sharing that the U.S. and our transatlantic partners should continue to work together on. So it's really serious. And just one last point here: we're now in the midst of this really important worldwide focus on racism, and I think it's important for us, as we're just as we say every time there's an anti-Semitic attack, that when there's anti-Semitism, there is hatred, and that affects so many other groups that are at risk. The same thing is true as we're focusing on racism. When there is racism is, again, there is hatred, and that puts the Jewish community at risk and evidences that kind of risk as well.
Absolutely. Where these social hatreds are interconnected, and some of the remedies for them apply across the board, and in other cases they're unique to the individual social illness. That's true of anti-Semitism. But I appreciate what you're saying about the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith is a big booster of the working definition, and I feel like if we could disseminate this to every educator or journalist or public official in our country and abroad. I think we do so much to shed much needed light on the problem so people would understand the problem for what it is. Nicu, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Definitely, yes. Look, Jews can never be made responsible for the plague again. This is not the world we live in anymore. This is not, we've come a long way from those times, but yet we see with sadness that they often do come back, they do resurge in times of crisis. And times of crisis perhaps give the feeling to some categories of people that anything goes. We have seen it in the way, for instance, that certain minorities in Europe were treated, including the experience of about 40% of Jewish Europeans, I have this number, that have experienced anti-Semitic harassment in recent years. That's data from the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency. Or outrageous claims, disinformation, fake news, hate speech. I have here in my notes instances of, the virus is fake, it's a Jewish conspiracy. I've seen this in various ways, including it's a Western conspiracy, or even outrageous acts like the Holocaust. I have something that's awful, as an example of hatred and things like that. I do not believe that the liberal world in which we live is suspended because these are exceptional times. It shouldn't be at all the case, and I fight this with all my strengths and through what I do. I do believe strongly that we need to keep the advances we have made on civil rights, on recognition of atrocious acts such as the Holocaust that the world has made. And a crisis is not an excuse for going back on any of those things. I think a big role plays education. You wouldn't believe how much hate speech came out of the crisis, including against Roma, for instance, in Europe. It's a big topic, against foreigners in general, against Jews. And I'm very happy that the new European Commission, this is our government, so to say, our European government is led by somebody who understands very well the problem, who has even nominated a speaker for anti-Semitism, Mrs. Katharina von Schnurbein. So I do believe that offices are not only symbolic, but they might be effective also. They're a big statement, a big political statement that we take the problem seriously.
Yeah, well, I think the office of Katharina von Schnurbein is both symbolic and significant, substantive. She's doing great work, and we appreciate that. Alina, you had a related question about anti-Semitism.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you both touched on the fact that during the crisis, a lot of anti-Semitism really exploded online. And I think the question of how do we deal with hate online is very much in focus right now, and we have an opportunity to really push the conversation on this front. It's interesting to see the difference of perspective between the EU and the United States with regards to questions of freedom of speech. And I think the EU has done really important work in terms of working with IT platforms such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, and others to get them to voluntarily come to the discussion table and agree to, for instance, remove illegal content and such things. And there is an interesting piece of legislation on the table in the EU, the Digital Service Act, which will basically regulate the online sphere in the decades to come, perhaps. The last such piece of legislation dates back to 2000. So MEP Stefanuta, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on the Digital Service Act and more broadly this question of aggressively tackling online hate speech, platform responsibility and such things. And as well, it would be fascinating to hear you, Representative Deutch, from a US perspective. So perhaps MEP
I'm interested as well because we might have diverging views. We do believe that companies have a responsibility of actively working and filtering or checking, because a platform such as Facebook has gained such an enormous market share that it can be considered of public importance in a sense. It's obviously it's a private company, but nevertheless it has a public use and as a platform. So quite frankly, as a legislator and as a politician, I'm quite concerned about the pervasiveness of disinformation, of hate speech in the context of COVID. I think even that the battle might be lost if we don't act soon, to be honest. And we have seen last night what happened in Serbia with protesters storming the parliament in order to stop another public health restrictions in the country. We see instances even in my country where obviously fake and obviously misinformed judgments about such an important issues like this crisis are basically pervasive in this society. If we allow it, even if we are tempted to allow it for political gains, perhaps, I think it might lead into a snowball. What next? Will then anti-Semitism be tolerated just because it might be popular in some circles, or it might be so pervasive online? No, we do believe that these things need to be regulated, and it does not mean that they go against free speech. So yes, we do believe that through the Digital Service Act and other legislation, companies have an obligation to help us on this work of filtering. And there's another discussion on artificial intelligence. I saw because the companies might argue that it's very hard to filter themselves this content, but there are certain triggers that might indicate false, hateful content that might be identified by basically algorithms, etc. So I'm not suggesting in any way that algorithms should filter our free speech. By the way, don't please let that not be the quote. But there are ways to make it cost efficient so that it's possible for the companies to actually do this service.
Congressman Deutch, as a lawyer and a lawmaker, I'm guessing you've had your share of experience explaining the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to our European friends, and how that might hamper us in our efforts to hate speech online and elsewhere.
Sure, but no one wants to limit First Amendment rights, but the First Amendment has always been subject to interpretation. There are limitations, and so when we talk about the need to protect the First Amendment, we're protecting the First Amendment subject to the limitations that already exist. Everyone knows that you can't scream fire in a crowded movie theater, is perhaps the most famous example from the Supreme Court. And in light of where we are with technology, I think it requires us to reassess the way that private companies fall back on the First Amendment as a defense when there are things that they can do and should do as private companies to better stop the flow of hatred. I think that combating misinformation, not a misstatement that you or I might make, or even a misstatement that a politician might make, perhaps having a sense that it may not be exactly as described, but just to make a general point. And we all want to be honest. Sometimes we say things that might not be exactly consistent with how someone else might view the same issue, but that's different than what we're seeing online. That's different than the huge sums of money and resources and personnel that in some cases foreign governments are using to propagate misinformation all throughout the internet and on social media platforms. And when Mark Zuckerberg, in response to a question during an interview, can't bring himself to acknowledge that Holocaust denial, which anyone acknowledges is not only factually incorrect, but ultimately anti-Semitic, if he can't bring himself to acknowledge that there is no place for that on the platform, then that raises all kinds of issues. And we need to have this conversation. We need to acknowledge the technology that exists. I don't accept the argument that companies don't have the resources to combat this. These are companies worth getting close to $1 trillion, hundreds of billions of dollars, and who invest massive amounts right now to screen out certain things that should not be on their platforms. They use technology to do that, and we ought to be able to use technology to ensure that we don't see the continued rise of misinformation utilized as a weapon to divide groups from one another and to elevate, in some cases, to elevate conspiracy theories that target Jews and people of color and other minority groups that put lives at risk. It's a natural extension from shouting, screaming "fire" in a crowded movie theater to the resources, the massive commitment among some to advance misinformation in an attempt to sow violence and hatred. And that's what we have an obligation to combat. So I actually probably find, I think there's probably more agreement between us than you might have thought.
Well, no, indeed, I agree with you 100%. I think it's reasonable to expect that the major actors on the internet, the service providers, the search engines, the social media platforms, act responsibly to conduct hatred. And I think it falls on all of us to convince them to do so. But you've segued nicely into my next question, which has to do with, which is very much related to social media, and it has to do with the legacy of the Holocaust in the 21st century. We are now 75 years past the end of World War II, and like anything, the passage of time has given us concern about the legacy of the Holocaust today, because you see a younger generation for whom the Holocaust, it's a chapter in the history book, and its lessons may have been faded or forgotten. And these are folks who are now taking on positions of leadership and responsibility, and we've seen Holocaust distortion or even denial on the rise. We've seen it on social media, but we see it in other sectors as well. And there was a CNN poll done 2 years ago in Europe, in which 1/3 of European respondents said they knew little or nothing at all about the Holocaust. This is the continent where the Holocaust took place. Congressman, I know that you represent a district that includes a number of Holocaust survivors and their children in Florida. And you were an original co-sponsor of the Never Again Holocaust Education Act, which B'nai B'rith strongly supported. And this bill is an important tool in Holocaust education. But do we have enough tools and resources to preserve Holocaust memory in the US and in Europe?
Well, I don't think that's a question, frankly, that we should entertain. And the answer is we have to have sufficient resources. And I just make two quick observations. The Holocaust, the Never Again Education Act passed immediately after the return of a bipartisan delegation that Speaker Pelosi led, that I was privileged to participate in, first to Auschwitz, and then on to Jerusalem, to Yad Vashem, where there was an unprecedented gathering of officials from around the world to vow never again and to vow to fight anti-Semitism. And then we came back and we passed this legislation, and it's a critical tool, but we have to do more. Just to follow up on our last question, the last question you asked, and our last discussion, there is now, because of technology. On the one hand, this is the last generation who will have the privilege of knowing and interacting directly with survivors, and we have a large survivor population in my district in South Florida, as you say, and the numbers are dwindling, and so we're clearly going to miss their voices. But we have such incredible technology, and so there are so many of their histories that have been captured that we will be able to reflect back on something that we don't really have from other groups. We need to utilize the technology more, and we need to recognize why it's so critical, not just in the United States, but globally, for us to continue to give meaning to the words "never again," because it's the Holocaust and the attempted genocide of the Jewish people is part and parcel of the ongoing effort by some to continue to demonize Jews or other groups with similar goals in mind. And by having this education, that's how we stop this. Just one other quick point. I had the privilege a couple of years back of meeting with Chancellor Merkel, who spoke powerfully about the special responsibility that she feels to ensure that Nazi victims, the Holocaust survivors, have what they need to live out their lives in dignity. As we go to the next generation, that's going to require our countries to work together to make sure that their memories continue to live on.
Yeah, and to Chancellor Merkel's credit, she's really made some landmark statements about the importance of not just combating anti-Semitism, but Germany's role specifically in that quest. And she is, in a way, emblematic of the condition that I spoke about earlier, this generational shift. She grew up in the early post-war era, and she knew what that meant for Germany. But younger leaders today don't have that same kind of personal experience, that same kind of historical memory. So we all need to be prepared for that. Nico, what is your perspective?
Not only is she, let's say, a fruit of those post-war times, but even more, I believe, the fact that she stems from Eastern Europe. I do as well. You know, she comes, and I come from another totalitarian regime that has presented one side of history, one version of history. And I believe for many people, it is very hard to shake that version of history off and to be ready and soak in the realities, the objective history, such thing exists. It certainly does as regards the Holocaust, and it was a very, very powerful commemoration this year in January in Auschwitz. I understand that the congressman was there for it. I was not as privileged. We did have the leadership of this house go. I wished I were there as well. Nevertheless, what I do believe is, especially for younger people, as I said, coming perhaps from totalitarian regimes, the willingness, the possibility to accept the objective history, the facts that were previously presented differently to them, is not easy. So that's where us legislators come in, and the importance of legislation, of commemoration, of imposing perhaps certain days, certain festivities, certain remembrances comes in, or funding certain projects, funding historical projects, funding monuments such as the one opened during the chancellor's time in Berlin. For instance, I think that that's an important thing. To be honest, I, as a Romanian, still struggle with the opinion some of my fellow countrymen have about the own genocide and our own participation in the Holocaust, and some of our totalitarian leaders from those times and their role in history. For Romanians or Hungarians, people like Horthy or Antonescu are powerful figures to be respected, and we fail to remember that they too played a role, an important role in the Holocaust. And I'm not happy with the state of play, I must say, and I think we as legislators should continue the good work because it's not easy, as I said, for the various reasons that I explained.
What you say is absolutely true about the responsibility of every country to confront its own history, its own past in an open and honest way. Romania, to its credit, established a historical commission to review its role in the Holocaust. B'nai B'rith was represented on that commission through our CEO, Dan Mariashin. Sounds like there is more work to be done. And but it's glad that we have good people holding the country and Romanian society accountable. If I can switch topics to the Middle East for a moment, Congressman, you authored a bill in 2015 to sanction Iran's proxy, Hezbollah. Unfortunately, you have a rich resume of accomplishments, so I'm able to draw on some of them and posing questions to you. But more recently, you led a congressional letter to the EU delegation in Washington calling for Europe to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. They've already designated the political wing, but we feel that it's a false bifurcation. Even Hezbollah feels it's a false bifurcation because money is a very fungible commodity and they really see the organization as an organic whole. So it's time already to ban the full organization. Germany this year finally made that decision, designated the entirety of Hezbollah as a terrorist group, and in doing so, they joined the U.S., the U.K., and the Netherlands. Do you think that the United States, for its part, will be able to use its good offices, transatlanticists like yourself, to convince the rest of the EU to follow Germany's lead?
Well, I certainly hope so. As you point out, it's an issue I've spent a lot of time raising with our European counterparts. And the letter that we just did with Congressman Zeldin, my colleague Congressman Zeldin, and Senators Rosen and Blackburn commends the German decision and urges that full designation by the EU. I acknowledge that there are challenges that exist to getting the full designation, and I'll let Nicu describe those. But it's clear that Hezbollah poses a global threat. They have a history of attacks around the world, particularly targeting the Jewish community. They raise money in Europe, they raise money in Latin America, in West Africa, and Iran's continued support for their terror proxies should be unacceptable to all responsible nations. We've worked together to pass strong bipartisan financial sanctions aimed at choking off Hezbollah's finances. This is an area where I actually give credit to the administration. They've been very aggressive in going after Iran's financial support for terrorism. But they're a terrorist group, but they're now essentially a terror army given what they've done on the battlefield in Syria. And this is the time, given the hits they've taken in Syria, given the economic challenges that Iran faces, where I think the world ought to come together to squeeze Hezbollah and to recognize that you can't have these artificial distinctions. A terrorist group is going to use any means it can to raise money to continue to fund terror. That's what we need to stop.
Right. Nicu, what's the perspective in the European Parliament right now?
I will tell you what my personal perspective is, and then I will comment on the union's perspective of the parliament. I find it very hard to say on the one hand that there's a military arm that's terroristic and there's a political arm that's legitimate somehow. I think that differentiation is not that straightforward to make. Now I think the lack of unity on the subject, perhaps in the European Union, even though there's clear member states that have shown clear definition of this, like the Netherlands, like Germany and others, stems from the way our foreign relation army is organized. The Union, unfortunately, is still unsatisfyingly weak on foreign relations and too much dependent on unanimity. So it suffices to have one or two member states that are not in agreement or have another perhaps nuance or have an interest or see the whole relation as a way of engaging in Lebanon, for instance, or have an alternative reason that it can actually block the whole process. And that's something as a parliamentarian, I'm striving for. Congressman, you can imagine if the United States were organized in such a fashion that each of the 50 states had a veto over your foreign policy, that would be impossible to manage. So I do believe perhaps that the conference on the future of union that is organized and perhaps will bring some treaty change will help us have some much needed steps forward on foreign relations, to have a bit of a qualified majority perhaps decision on foreign relations as well. I know that many of my European viewers will say that's idealistic, but I think it's time to shift to this kind of perspective. It's easy to compare. We strive to be economically, politically as important as the United States, perhaps, but that's impossible without having an actual foreign policy arm in this whole equation. So.
Well, I'll say on B'nai B'rith's half, we hope that Germany, having just made this decision for their own government and now occupying the EU Council presidency, will use this opportunity to bring the rest of the EU along. But of course, we recognize the difficulties in forming consensus as you're describing them. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I have two questions left that I would like to pose, so if we can do them efficiently, perhaps. But the first one is related to the topic we just discussed, and that's Hezbollah's parent regime, which is Iran. And I'm curious to know, Congressman Deutch, you were I think in the minority among congressional Democrats in opposing the Iran nuclear deal 5 years ago. But then once we're in it, your position was that we should remain in. The U.S. withdrew after the change of administrations and has been pursuing a policy of increased sanctions. And I'm curious to know how you feel we should go from here. Should it be more pressure, or do you have in mind in the future some sort of second attempt at a deal, maybe a tougher deal than we had the first time, and including more of Iran's malign behavior, not just the nuclear threat? How do you see it?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, the Security Council resolution that governed the JCPOA had an arms embargo that expires in October. We just sent a letter, 387 members of Congress actually sent a letter to the administration urging the extension of the ban, because clearly our European partners don't want to see Iran buying Russian and Chinese arms and sending them to their proxies, causing even greater instability in the Middle East and elsewhere. And you're right, I thought it was a mistake to abandon the JCPOA. But I knew when I opposed it that it would, in the short term, it would likely see Iran comply because of the benefits that they were getting from it, and they did. But going forward, when we walked away right at the moment when our European partners were actually negotiating with us on this to strengthen it, I think we lost the ability, we lost leverage to lead there. So now, yes, do I think that we can address some of those shortfalls in the original deal, specifically the sunsets and access issues? Yeah, and in light of the news of the plans that Iran had to take these advanced centrifuges that they were developing that now got set back by this explosion and move them to a secret location, I think there's a greater willingness to engage in ways to do that. I think that's the right approach. And again, it all gets back to American leadership. We have the ability to lead our allies who share the same concerns about Iran that we do. I just don't want to miss that opportunity.
Excellent. Nicu, what is your view of next steps on Iran?
I will touch on JCPOA as well, but I want to start from a perhaps more humanitarian point of view, because Iran has been one of the nations that was badly touched by the coronavirus, and in which the numbers have been dreadful, largely hidden from plain sight by the mullahs, and so I do believe that some leverage need to exist so that issues like humanitarian aid can still go on as normal while we talk about wider security options. Unfortunately, the U.S. aid that was offered was refused quite bluntly by the Iranians. I do believe Europe as a soft power, at least in the eyes of many nations around the world, could have an advantage there, an advantage that perhaps the United States does not have, given its perhaps its reputation as a more global power in the traditional sense, let's say. However, on JCPOA, and that's a point where we clashed many times with our American friends. I was responsible for negotiating those statements at the end of a TLD, Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. Congressman Deutch has honored us with his presence several times there. And every time when we got to the paragraph relating to Iran and JCPOA, we knew it was more like the European side thinks this, the American side thinks that. Now that I'm a politician myself, I can say that the value of an international agreement is as good as its implementation and its control are. If you cannot ensure implementation and control, then that agreement is virtually pointless. So I do believe there's many things that the JCPOA did not fulfill, and I wish to see perhaps the wider comprehensive framework come back to life and us playing a role in it. We do have to differentiate between the wider population of Iran and its regime, I do believe, and I think we saw it even during the protests that we saw in Iran, and also during the deplorable situation of the people during the coronavirus.
Thank you. Okay, so for our final question, we can't let this conversation pass without a question about Israel, and I'm interested now in the relationships, vital relationships Israel has with both the United States and the EU. And Congressman, I have to say, one thing I really appreciate about your contribution, this discussion is, I feel like you have struck a bipartisan tone. And in other words, there are values and interests at stake in U.S. foreign policy, and I think you speak about those values not as partisan as much as an American patriot who wants to see those interests advanced, and I think that kind of broad bipartisan approach is something that we certainly appreciate. B'nai B'rith is a nonpartisan 501c3, and so we respect that. But on that note about bipartisanship, I'm wondering how you feel about the trajectory of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The reason I'm asking is because we have seen in the last few years or upcoming several colleagues of yours, longtime stalwarts. I won't even single out names, but there have been several members who either have lost primary elections or they're retiring, and the composition of Congress changes. It's an elected body after all. But these colleagues of yours were people who understood very well the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And the people who come after them, who might be younger, might be coming from a different vantage point, maybe they're not bringing the same assumptions and understandings. We don't know. But what in any case, we really want to see this bipartisan commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship continue. And what are your thoughts and projections about that?
Sure, given the hour, I'll be brief. There are of the new members in the House of Representatives. I had the privilege of traveling with most of them to Israel last summer, and there is a real appreciation for the fact that the U.S.-Israel relationship is based on shared values and shared interests, and that we need to work to strengthen that. Look, there are some who believe it's somehow in their best interest politically to try to make the U.S.-Israel relationship a partisan issue. It's true for some on the left. It's true for some on the right. And they're all wrong. The fact is, there is a long and close relationship that exists because of these shared values, and at a time when these values, the values of democracy and freedom and commitment to human rights and the humanitarian response around the world, when these values are threatened in so many places, we ought to be standing with our friends and highlighting those relationships. And that's what the vast majority of members of Congress want to do. That's why almost 400 people voted to condemn BDS. It's why a huge number of members voted to reaffirm the security support for Israel, and why we voted unanimously to pass my legislation to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I think there are some that think that it's good to stir things up, but I think when you look at where members are and how they vote and what they believe, they recognize the importance of highlighting these values at this challenging time in the world's history.
Excellent. Alina, did you have a question or comment for Nico regarding the EU-Israel relationship?
Absolutely. Perhaps just to go back for a note, I just wanted to really commend you, MEP Stefanuta, on being explicit on the Hezbollah question and explicitly saying that the distinction between the military and the political wing is somewhat artificial, because I think any bit of momentum right now is really, really important. So kudos for that. On the Israel front, I think for sure, compared to the United States, the EU-Israel relation at least appears to be much more contentious at times, while there are a lot of elements to be celebrated: a strong trade relationship, a strong exchange on research and development. What can we do to kind of highlight these positive elements more and make it more core of the EU narrative that this relationship is really essential?
It's a good question and a good challenge, because I do believe that because Israel is a democracy and it's something with which we identify very strongly, it's a state that respects the rule of law, separation of power, etc. It's something that Europeans cherish a lot. And as you pointed out, even though maybe in the public eye there might be, you called it contentious, I would disagree with that, because we've just voted on aviation issues, on trade issues, etc., where it was clear that there's a large majority in this House that is friendly towards Israel. Having said that, Europeans are very attentive at current events. They're very sensitive, and happy about the Israeli democracy. I personally have very much enjoyed listening to a book about the 90s. I must say, I'm a big Yitzhak Rabin fan, and you might agree or not. I like him as a politician rather, and it was enjoyable to listen to those times, to the 90s and the political debate in Israel, because that, I think, was the time when the origin of the current political debates in Israel. I think the 90s kind of set the tone for the 2000s, to be honest. And but as I said, I do believe, because we have these structural values in common, I think we are on a good path. And we might disagree actually on tactics every now and then. We might disagree on tactics. We might disagree on certain elements of the Trump plan, perhaps. But I think we're running out of time, and that's an entire subject in itself. But nevertheless, the fundamentals are strong, and that's the same, I believe, as regards EU-US relations. I use that little joke in the beginning, that anecdote with the chlorinated chicken and the marriage, etc., especially to portray that the fundamentals are there. The love is there. The natural relationship is there. What we do sometimes perhaps deviate from one another is tactics.
Well, thank you very much. And that's really a perfect way to end this discussion. We've identified differing tactics or strategies in some cases, but shared values above all. And I think this is what really characterizes the transatlantic partnership. And I'm glad that you are both advocates for that partnership, and we're going to try to do our part as well, B'nai B'rith as an NGO. And so thank you very much to both of you for participating in this important discussion. Thank you also to our viewers. Please look forward for announcements for more virtual programs, or visit us at our website at b'naibrith.org. Thank you very much, everyone. Please stay safe and have a good day.
Thank you, B'nai B'rith.
Thank you.
Thank you.